Good evening. This is Donna Blomquist from the LaSalle Public Library welcoming you to tonight's program. This is live virtual programming with Dr. Saridakis from the Museum of Science and Industry. We will begin in just a minute. I wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this program and it will be available as a link on our website. And now let's welcome Dr. Voula Saridakis from the Museum of Science and Industry.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited.
Well, I'll let you begin. I'm not sure even where to start. I think I will let you just begin to kind of introduce yourself and share your slides. And then I'm going to ask our audience to put their questions in the chat box and we'll cover them at the end. So, Dr. Saridakis.
All right, thank you. So I'm going, all right, great, thank you. I appreciate the help. Okay, so thank you once again, and I'm excited to be here to talk about the remarkable history of the U-505. There's just so much history, and so where do I begin? Where do I end? How much do I include and how much do I not include? There's so much that I can share, and so hopefully I've done justice to presenting you with this succinct sort of history, the remarkable history from the time that the U-505 was built and commissioned to the present, actually. So with that, let's begin. And once again, just to check, Donna, you see the screen?
We do. It's perfect.
Okay, great. All right. So let me go to the first slide. All right, so we're going to start off with some early history of the U-505, just to share with you some of the characteristics, its early history, and some of the first patrols. So first of all, it is a Type 9C submarine, and there were variations to the Type 9s. There was for example, the D and various other, there were variants. This particular sub was 750 tons of submarine, 252 feet in length, and the pressure hull diameter was 14.4 feet. She displaced, and I do refer to the U-505 as she throughout the presentation, she displaced 1,220 tons of water surfaced and 1,232 tons submerged. And the range was 13,450 miles while cruising on the surface at 10 knots and 63 miles submerged at 14 knots, 4 knots. Now, weaponry. There were 22 torpedoes stowed on board, 12 in the pressure hull, 10 in pressure tight containers on the deck, and there were 6 torpedo tubes total, and you can kind of make them out here in this cross-section view of the U-505, 4 in the bow and 2 in the stern. And as far as the deck weaponry was concerned, that was often modified during the war. So it all depended at what point in time you were looking at the submarine. But at the time of her capture, she carried a larger anti-aircraft gun on the lower open bridge and 2 twin-barrel anti-aircraft guns on the upper open bridge. And what made her go? So propulsion. Propulsion machinery included 2,170 horsepower, 9-cylinder supercharged 4-cycle diesel electric engines, that's a lot of words there, that were cooled with salt water, and while submerged, she was powered by 2 electric motors supplied with 2 banks of batteries. And finally, the complement, how many submariners were on board. The standard was 48, 4 officers, 15 petty officers, and 29 other submariners. And after 1943, anti-aircraft gunners were also added to the crew, which then came to a total of 59. So there were 59 submariners on board at the time of her capture. Now I wanted to include, in addition to this cross-section, include this other little photo that you see to the bottom right here. This is not the U-505. This is another similar type of submarine, but just to show you how cramped the quarters were and the living conditions. Here is where you have the bunks, which were often in the same place where you had the torpedo tubes in the aft and forward torpedo rooms. And those bunks were made to lift and move out of the way in case you needed to use these rooms for torpedoes, to launch torpedoes. And the crews often practiced something that was known as hot bunking. So that meant that they would take turns and rotate their shifts, and half the crew would sleep and the other half crew would be on duty, and then they would switch it out. And that's usually how it happened. And you can see that in this photo. Okay, so a little bit about the early history of the U-505. The U-505 was built in Hamburg in Germany, launched May 24th, 1941. She was a larger boat compared to her forerunners, which meant she could operate further from home. And that means that she was meant to operate more like as a lone wolf rather than part of a wolf pack, although she briefly served as part of a wolf pack on one of her patrols. But really, for the most part, she was a lone wolf. Now, the first 3 patrols of the U-505 were under the first captain. The first captain, you can see the 3 names there. The first one is Axel Olaf Loa. And he served for the first 3 patrols, but then had to relinquish his control. Why, may you ask? And that is because he developed appendicitis. And so, unfortunately, he could not return to duty. And so then in September 15th of 1942, the second commanding officer took control of the U-505, a 24-year-old by the name of Peter Schenk. Now, at this time, the luck, if you will, of the U-505 began to turn. Things were getting kind of dicey for a variety of reasons. And she frequently had to be repaired because of bombings or because of other problems that were happening on the U-505. Add to which that Peter Schenk was not as well liked as Loa had been his predecessor. He was eccentric, and the crew took some sort of issue with him. And then to make matters worse, like I said, sort of a bunch of things started to happen. So for instance, in November 10th of 1942, the U-505 was heavily damaged. You can see the damage there, heavily damaged by an RAF, that's Royal Air Force, British, Hudson 2-engine bomber. And unfortunately, I should add that one of the depth charges that the bomber released was discharged prematurely on the deck. This meant that the bomber was critically damaged and unfortunately crashed into the sea, killing its entire crew. Now the boat, the U-505, was repaired, eventually repaired, but over the next few months, again, she found herself going in and out of port to fix repairs for a variety of reasons. And port was Lorient in France, off the coast of France. So a lot of Frenchmen, and this will be important for in a bit, worked on her. So it wasn't just German crew and mechanics, but also French men that were involved in fixing her. Now, add to which, during this time, the Battle of the Atlantic that was being fought was shifting in favor of the Allies. More U-boats were being sunk, and so what happens is in this shift, the hunters become hunted, and a large reason for that was because of these new task forces that were playing a larger and larger role on the Atlantic, which I'll get to more of in a moment as well. So the boat repeatedly would get damaged and attacked. Schenk himself kept hearing about U-boat losses and close friends losing their lives every time he returned to port in Lorient in France. And it was sad because at one point repairmen found gaskets that had been eaten away, which made the Germans think that the French laborers that I mentioned before had committed sabotage. And because of this, these Frenchmen were gathered, they were arrested, and they were shot. So very tragic. But by October of 1943, Schenk had reached his breaking point. And while at sea and while the U-505 was submerged, crew reported hearing distant explosions, exploding charges. And when the explosions started coming closer and closer to the U-505 into the hull, the interior of the U-505 became more and more damaged as a result. Schenk felt like he just broke. He had reached his limit and committed suicide by shooting himself And this was all, again, inside the U-505 at that point in time. One of the officers assumed control at that moment. And fortunately, despite all these barrage of bombs that were happening in the water while they were submerged, the officer who assumed command was able to keep the U-505 safe and escape enemy assault and surface. And when they surfaced at that point in time, Schenk's body was committed to the sea. And then finally, on November 8th of 1943, the third and final captain, that would be Harold Lange, assumed command and remained captain until the capture of the submarine, which happened on June 4th of 1944. He did lose his leg in the battle, and afterwards, Lange became a POW, like many of the others that had been captured and pulled out of the water, a POW for more than 2 years before he was eventually freed and returned to Germany. Okay, so now we'll shift gears and look at the American side of things. So the American sailors, and in particular, Task Force 22.3. And the task force, this particular task force was led by the USS Guadalcanal, which you could see pictured here. This picture is actually taken a couple of months after the capture of the U-505. Now, let me backtrack a moment and just mention this important fact. Even before officially entering the war, the United States realized, and this was the mid-1930s, mid to late 1930s, the United States Navy realized that in order to protect ships against U-boats, they would need to create what were called U-boat hunter-killer groups, led by an aircraft carrier, and in our case here, it's the USS Guadalcanal, with a bunch of planes that were flying in support of the Guadalcanal, the carrier, as well as the assistant destroyers, usually a group of destroyers that were a part of the task force. And you can see some of these aircraft in this photo here. That's, by the way, Captain Dan Gallery, who was the captain of the USS Guadalcanal at the time of the capture of the U-505. And on the deck you see there, but they had their wings raised on the sides there. There were two particular types of planes that were very common among these carriers: the fighters, which were Wildcats, and the bomber planes, which were the Avengers. And like I said, they were always usually accompanied by smaller destroyer ships. So as I mentioned earlier, by 1943, the tide was turning in favor of Allied ships in the Atlantic against the U-boats. And it was in this year, September 25th of 1943, that the USS Guadalcanal was commissioned. This was in Vancouver, Washington. And Captain Dan Gallery was on board as the skipper. Now, let me just add this, because this is an important little detail. Gallery was a native of Chicago, and that's going to play a major role later in why the U-505 ends up at the Museum of Science and Industry. So at the time that this task force under Gallery sets off for their second patrol, the one, and this is again the one that leads up to the capture of the U-505, they were accompanied by several smaller destroyers, but three in particular play a really pivotal role in the capture, the battle and capture of the U-505, the USS Pillsbury, the USS Jenks, and the USS Chatelaine. Now, before the battle and capture of the U-505, this is also really important, Gallery himself had suggested at a conference, and this was on land with other members of the Navy, officers of the Navy, that when a surfaced U-boat was crippled and abandoned by her crew, instead of destroying the sub and sending her to the bottom of the ocean, every attempt should be made to capture the boat as a prize and bring her back to the United States. And so that was already in the minds of Gallery and his crew before the first sonar contact had even been made with the U-505. So this was already brewing, or marinating, if you will, and he had already actually even made lists of potential boarding parties should this ever happen. And sure enough, it happens very soon after this conference. So on the morning of June 4th, 1944, at 11:12 a.m., the USS Chatelaine reports contact with a submarine off the coast of West Africa. and fires a barrage of hedgehogs to try to make the subsurface, and that did not work. And so in response, the U-505 does what any boat would do under the circumstances. You submerge. You do not want to fall prey to surface vessels, and you are sitting duck if you are on the surface. You always try to submerge. Now, at the time, there was already a Wildcat and an Avenger from the USS Guadalcanal circling around in the air, and they could actually see that sub from above and its attempt to submerge. And they fire a burst of machine gun fire into the water to indicate the other ships the position of the sub. The USS Chatelaine was then able to make sonar contact, knowing where it was. They made sonar contact, and they fire a series of depth charges around the U-505. Not so much because they wanted to destroy the sub and make it sink, but rather to damage it, cripple it, do what was necessary to make it come up to the surface. And sure enough, that's what the sub does. It rises up to the surface of the water in plain view of the entire task force, at which point the planes, the USS Chatelaine, the Jenks, and the Pillsbury all open fire on the U-505, because the U-505 was fighting back. It looked like it was turning around to fight back and launch torpedoes. But soon, her crew, and this was witnessed by the American sailors, very soon after, the crew emerged from the conning tower and other deck hatches to abandon ship, at which point the order was sent by the Americans in charge. The order was sent out to cease all fire on the sub, because if you keep firing, that sub's gonna just sink. So when all was said and done, despite the fact that there were 59 members on board, as it turns out, only one German crewman, despite all the fire on to the U-505, only one German crewman was killed during the battle, while all the others escaped in life rafts. And then eventually they were all picked up by the destroyers and the Guadalcanal. So at this point, an order that had not been heard since 1812 was issued: away all boarders, which means let's man the whale boats with the boarding crews and send them out there to rescue, to salvage the U-505. So the Pillsbury was the first to send the boarding party towards the sub, not knowing, and maybe you can see my little arrow here. This is the little whale boat right down here in this picture on the left, next to the sub. You can see that little whale boat. That is from the USS Pillsbury. That was the first boarding party. And they had no way of knowing what was gonna happen. Was the sub gonna explode? Were there, were orders? Longa himself had issued orders to set the charges that would eventually scuttle the ship. But the crew got out so quickly that they didn't set the charges. But the Americans had no way of knowing that. And in fact, they believed that there could even still be German crewmen on board underneath the belly of the beast, so to speak, setting up demolition charges. So it was a pretty gutsy move on their part, just to say that. And yet the crewmen of the whale boat from the USS Pillsbury, they jumped down the conning tower and all in an attempt to capture again and save the U-505. Now to do this, of course, they had to close all the valves, including a strainer, which was about 6 inches in diameter. It wasn't a very big strainer at all, but there was a large amount of water that was flowing into the sub through that particular strainer. If that strainer did not close, if it was not, the lid not put back on, that sub was going to sink. There was no doubt about that. But there was one crewman by the name of, he was a motor mechanist's mate, first class, and his name was Zenon Lukosius, who saved the sub when he found the cover, and he quickly covered that sea strainer. Had that sea strainer not, the lid not been put on it, after only about 3 or 4 minutes more beyond that point, the sub would have tilted even more because of the weight of the water and would have sunk regardless of the efforts of any of those particular sailors. So really it was saving that sub just in the nick of time. And so once that happened, it was time to try to salvage the U-505, do what was necessary to make her seaworthy again, and she was damaged in the water. all that you could see, and this is sort of an iconic photo that you can see to the right here, where the American sailors, not just in Pillsbury, but a couple of other boarding parties, are on top of the U-505, and all you could really see was the front of, or the bow of the U-505 and the conning tower that emerges from the top of that sub. The rest of it was underwater. And there was a lot of water inside. They really had to do what was necessary to prevent her from sinking, which they had already managed, but then to be able to tow her back to a harbor. And initially they thought, okay, well, how about we take her back to some port in Western Africa? But that was quickly rejected because there were too many spies in Western Africa. So orders were received by Gallery to tow the sub back to Bermuda. And in order to do this, they had to bring in a tug by the name of the Abnaki. So let me see here. All right. And that photo on the left, the far left there, you can see that is the Abnaki towing the U-505, flying the American flag with this large cable. And in order to do this, of course, the bilges had to be pumped again. There was a lot of water, heavy weights had to be removed. All gear had to be offloaded onto the Guadalcanal. All this took place over a period of several days. In the meantime, of course, we had a little something known as D-Day happen, because this was June 4th, the battle and capture. And D-Day happened only 2 days later, but Germany had not surrendered yet. And that was really important because they wanted to keep everything under wraps, the Navy and the government. No one could find out that this U-boat had been captured and that it was being towed back to the United States. And that was really important. Now, there were secret papers and Enigma machines on board the U-505. Those had already been removed in previous days by the time she began being towed back to, being towed over to Bermuda. And the U-5, so the Enigma machines, because there's been a lot of information and movies and books written about Enigma machines recently. The Enigma code itself had already been cracked, but it was still invaluable to acquire the Enigma machines from the U-505 because those at least gave the latest ship positions of the Germans and including the most recent codes of the Enigma machines. So it wasn't like they were totally useless, but you know, just FYI, the Enigma code had already been cracked, but they still were useful to the Americans. So the U-505 gets towed back by the Abnaki, or towed over to Bermuda by the Abnaki. Everything was top secret. The U-505 was even repainted and renamed the Nemo from Jules Verne's Sea Adventures, and the U-505 was referred to as the Nemo and kept hidden until victory in Europe was declared. Gallery, you may be wondering how, you know, what about all those American sailors? Because you have the Guadalcanal, you have the destroyers. We're talking about 3,000 or so men. Gallery made sure that these 3,000 or so men were briefed on keeping everything secret. Not even their families could be told of their capture of the U-boat, which, as far as we know, that was the case. Once they reached Bermuda, the sub was camouflaged, hidden until the war ended in Europe. And as far as the Germans were concerned, they lost contact with the U-505. It was lost at sea. The crew had all perished. But actually, the fate was of the crew that were rescued from the waters. They were transported to a POW camp called Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and they were secretly kept there until, again, after the war ended in Europe, not even allowed to contact their relatives or vice versa. So everyone did think that they had perished, truly perished with the sinking of the U-505. So you could see, by the way, in this middle photo that they did do exercises on the USS Guadalcanal, and then the far right picture is some of these POWs at Camp Ruston. Okay, so what happens between the end of the war in 1945 to the point where the U-505 comes to the Museum of Science and Industry in 1954? So it wasn't until May 16th of 1945 when Germany surrenders. It was actually 9 days after this date in when Germany surrenders, that the big reveal happens and everybody, the public, finds out that the U-505 was in Bermuda, and then she sailed to New Hampshire as well. After that point, there's no reason to keep her camouflaged. So she's parked in the Navy Yard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Germans learn about the capture, and they're happy, in fact, that the U-505 sailors are alive and well, had not been lost at sea. Now, here's the thing, though. The war had not completely ended. The war in Europe had ended, but not in the Pacific theater. And so because the war in the Pacific had not ended, a decision had been made to sail the U-505 to different port cities, from New York to Miami, where visitors would visit the sub. The price for the tour of the sub was a war bond, buying a war bond. And this was what was referred to as the Seventh War Loan. You buy a war bond and you support the rest of World War II, which again was still raging in the Pacific. So after the war, World War II in its entirety comes to an end. That's when she's finally taken up to New Hampshire, to the Navy Yard at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And the original fate of the U-505, like all other U-boats after World War II, was that she was going to be scrapped because the four powers, the Allied powers, had made this agreement that that's what they were going to do with these U-boats. That consisted of the United States, Britain, France, and Russia. And so they had all agreed that the fate of all operational U-boats at the end of the war would be that they would get scrapped. The gallery steps in at this point in time and says, no, she'd been captured in battle on the high seas, and therefore she was United States property. And the governments, there was really no precedent for any of this because it had been done before, and they really couldn't do much as a result. And the Navy finally agreed not to scuttle the ship as a result. And once the sub was safe from being scrapped, Dan Gallery's brother, and this is according to Dan Gallery himself, Dan Gallery's brother, John Gallery, and he was a chaplain in the Navy, suggested that the U-505 be brought to Chicago as a memorial to the thousands of seamen who had lost their lives in both world wars. And because, of course, the Gallery brothers were from Chicago, Chicago was the place that was chosen for her ultimate resting place, and then specifically the Museum of Science and Industry. Now, by the time that this was all decided, she was a derelict, and you can see that in the smaller photo to the left there. The one on the right is during the Seventh War Bond, when she's going by New York. You could see the New York skyline there. And so at this time, the president of MSI was Lennox Lord. He was ecstatic over the idea of MSI inheriting a sub. In fact, MSI had already been looking for a submarine, but even as far back as the 1930s, when the museum first opened. So getting their hands on a sub was not anything new, and they were really excited that it was going to become a reality. But you needed the money, because the Navy wasn't about to pay to have the U-505 towed from New Hampshire to Chicago for the move. Once the museum gained the title, she was made seaworthy once again, fixed up, because you could see she was rather much of a derelict in '53. And she was eventually towed to Chicago from around, you could see this little path in this little map that I have here of an image, around there, the Canada, down the St. Lawrence River, and across 4 of the 5 Great Lakes over a distance of approximately 3,000 miles. And she sailed down past Chicago to the 57th Street beach, which is next to MSI, and parked on the beach. And you can see there are 2 different, one is the aerial view from being parked on the beach, and one is, from the bather's point of view. Just imagine it's the summer of 1954, and you go to the beach, and there you see this German submarine from World War II parked right on the beach. So it was quite a sight to behold. And so finally, things were in place where she could be hauled over to the museum and opened as an exhibit. This happens on September 2nd of 1954. It was an overnight haul. Lakeshore Drive, which is the main thoroughfare that you see there in that aerial view between the sub and the museum, was shut down. And she was raised, pulled over Lakeshore Drive, pivoted so that she came up alongside the eastern side of the museum facing the lake, and placed there, lowered into position. And finally, in September of the 25th of 1954, she was dedicated as a memorial to the 55,000 Americans who died in the Battle of the Atlantic during the two world wars. But now really, I think she represents a memorial to both men and women who lost their lives at sea, wherever, during the two world wars. Okay, so the U-505 opens up as an exhibit in 54, and a lot of work has to be done to convert her into an exhibit. Once all that happens, the U-505 becomes the most popular attraction at the museum, and she remains among the most iconic exhibits at MSI, and reunions are held in the subsequent decades after she comes to MSI as an exhibit. A couple that are worth mentioning are the one in 1964, because that was attended by both Admiral Gallery, who's an admiral by this point in time, and the former captain, who was the captain at the time that she was captured, Harold Longa, who flies over just for this particular reunion. And you can see there, they're holding binoculars, and then there's an exchange they're about to shake hands. That's in the bottom left photo there. The other notable reunion was 1982, because this was attended by American sailors as well as U-505 crew. About 11 of the original 58 that were POWs were present for that particular reunion. Now, in the decades that followed, even after opening as an exhibit, she was outside, bear that in mind, and a lot of paint was needed, both inside and outside. Fix her up, keep fixing her up. Chicago weather would eventually take its toll over time, and she began to deteriorate. In the meantime, in 1989, she's designated a National Historic Landmark, which was huge. But by the 1990s, it became clear that in order to preserve her for future generations, she had to be brought indoors, which meant creating a new underground exhibit space for her. This, the campaign for this was raised more than $29 million for this reason, and created this climate-controlled underground exhibit space, incredible space. And this meant that artifacts and displays would be put together in this exhibit that could tell a more compelling story of the U-505. She underwent more painting and conservation, specifically to return her to the original colors that the Germans had used and to fix deterioration to the hull. You can see in that top photo there in the center, her being removed from that space, and she's being brought close to that big, what looks like this huge tub. She's going to be placed inside, it's going to be covered, and that's underground next to the museum's parking lot in the northern, next to the northern entrance there. So guests would come through, they would learn about World War II, they would learn about the Battle of the Atlantic, about the battle and the capture. They would turn a corner and they would see the sub, many for the first time. And it is a sight to behold because it is so unexpected. And I never get tired of being right there on that balcony, watching guests come through, and these visitors would take that turn and just see it and be just amazed and just awestruck at the fact that there you go, there is a huge German submarine parked right inside this underground exhibit space. Okay. So just to sort of wrap things up here, I want to talk a little bit about this new exhibit that went up last year, as well as the 2 years leading up to it that meant more conservation work on the U-505. So last year, June 4th, 2019, marked the 75th anniversary commemorating the capture of the U-505. So there was, as in previous reunions, well, in previous anniversaries, I should say, wreath laying ceremony. This was the first time that none of the original American sailors that were part of the capture attended. They've all passed away, which is just sad. But the wreath laying ceremony was truly special. And MSI opened up at the on the same day a new temporary exhibit called U-505 75 Stories, it was my honor to curate this particular exhibit. And this exhibit was meant, you could see a photo of half the room in which you find this exhibit. It was meant to focus more on the lives of both the American and the German sailors and submariners, told through these rarely seen photographs from our archives, as well as a number of other artifacts that hadn't really made it into the permanent exhibit, which I mentioned previously. I encourage you to come to the museum and see it before it comes down, because this is a temporary exhibit. And it's a wonderful view into the daily lives of these sailors, which you get, again, a better sense of what life was like on the submarine especially. I mentioned it before at the beginning of the talk, you know, the hot bunking, living in these cramped quarters. It was so important to keep morale up, and they managed to do a really great job doing that. The soldiers were fed 3 meals a day, or the submariners, I should say, 3 meals a day. So everything was done to you know, pass their time, because a lot of it was spent at sea when there wasn't, as you know, a lot of things going on at the time. So so that exhibit, you can see that that's to the left. Now, what you see here in the center and to the right, these are part of this exhibit as well, but they speak to this 2-year conservation project that I just mentioned. MSI was awarded a grant to conserve portions of the U-505. It was a 2-year grant that lasted from 2017 to 2019. And specifically, the portions that were conserved were the conning tower, the galley, the aft torpedo room, and the control room for the most part. And you can see in the center photo there, this board that was created by our preparer, using materials that the women that had come to conserve the U-boat, this company, to help, you know, repaint it again to the true colors of the U-505. You can see this board bottom right in that center photo, sort of a swatch of different colors. And those were colors to try to match modern day colors that were meant to try to match to the original colors that the Germans used. And you can see various other tools and solutions that are used to fix the submarine. There is a lot of research that goes into it, a lot of work that goes into it, prep work before that first brush even touches the U-505. So that was a success, and it really did help preserve some very iconic portions of the U-505. And then to the right, we included this little before and after, just to give you a sense of what that looked like. So in this photo, there are 2 things I'd point out. One is, again, the colors, repainting portions like that, what looks like a little control box, and the wheel that's on that hatch, you know, repainting those to the traditional colors, true colors, as well as fixing that flooring, that green flooring that you see there, fixing that up as well. And in some cases, creating pieces, fresh pieces to place in there, because the original pieces might not be stable enough or be able to be preserved as well. So all sorts of different things that had to be done in order to preserve the U-505. And that's going to continue. And conserving the sub takes a lot of work and has to be done on a regular basis. That's a given. But as stewards of the U-505, the Museum of Science and Industry recognizes the need to periodically, you know, conserve and preserve the U-505 for future generations. And we're very excited that we could do this, and that future guests, whether it's, you know, young children all the way up to older adults, can come and see this and learn all about just all sorts of different aspects of this period of time and of this technology and of the submariners and the sailors that were involved. So that is it. And just finally, thank you so much for joining me on this journey. And my email, as you can see, that's right up there. In the event that you'd like to reach out to me, I'm more than happy to answer more questions regarding the U-505 or any other questions you might have about working in collections at the Museum of Science and Industry. So thank you once again.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Saridakis. That is just an incredible journey through, and I'm sure you just covered the high points. I
Yes.
did go online and read the background on this exhibit, and it's long and remarkable, and pretty much every paragraph has more insights and so much to learn. So I would encourage our audience to share in that. It is quite remarkable. We did get a question from one of our viewers who asked how long the temporary exhibit will be open. And my question is, how does the pandemic restrictions affect attending and, inside the submarine as well as the exhibits?
Right, really great question. So the first part, which is how long will this temporary exhibit be up? So currently it should be up at least, I don't have the exact date of when it's going to come down, but the museum is now open. So it's open now and will remain open. I would think for at least another, definitely another couple of months, maybe 3-4 months. I mean, it's not gonna, there's no plans to take it down anytime real soon. All the more reason to come and visit the museum and to visit this particular exhibit, which is, I think, a great teaser into, you keep walking and then you get to the end of the hall, make a left, and you enter the U-505s. It's a nice little taste of things to come with a permanent exhibit. Now, the second part of the question relating to COVID, yeah, so just like with other parts of the museum, there's certain things, certain exhibits had to be modified or some had to be closed. When it comes to the exhibit space that you see here in this particular photo, the one thing that I would point out is that the on-tour, the tour of the inside of the U-505 is temporarily closed, but we can't wait until we will one day reopen the interior so that we can restart the onboard tours of the U-505. And I should add that you see my background, right? And it looks like I'm inside the U-505, I'm not. And that is the engine room that's right behind me. So that's my background screen. But like I said, we're looking forward to the day when we can reopen it for onboard tours.
Well, I hope that's very soon. I think we all do. In the meantime, we should come and see the temporary exhibit. Another question, are there any other U-boats still extant anywhere?
Yeah, there are several U-boats. There's many U-boats, but if we're specifically talking about the Type 9C, there's only about 3 other U-boats out there that are in, similar condition, like, decent condition or better, if you will. So they're not, again, that many. And again, it goes back to what I was saying before about the intentional scuttling of U-boats after the war. A lot of them have been damaged. The U-boat fleet, there were more than 1,100 or so U-boats or so that were made and set out to sea. And out of the 1,100 or so, I think it was only about 300 eventually survived around by the time of the end of the war. So that gives you a good sense of, the fate of many, many of these U-boats. So that's why you don't see that many U-boats out there. But what makes this so special again is that it's been conserved, and you can come and see for yourself just exactly what conditions were like for these German submariners. U-boats have changed over time, but for this particular instance, what life was like, and some of that technology as well that that they used.
We have another comment here, an observation. One of our guests says that museum guests can take a U-505 sneak peek into the petty officers' quarters. Facilitators are stationed near the U-505 to talk to guests and answer questions. And she said, I am an MSI facilitator. So there. Did you want to enlarge on that?
It's my understanding, again, that the guests can peek inside and they can see it. But in terms of, again, if we're talking about the onboard tours, those have temporarily been suspended. But you know, the curtains have been pulled back, so to speak. You can, when you come to the museum, peek inside and take a look. So that's definitely worth doing. Do not leave that exhibit without doing that.
Okay, here's another question. Is the color in this picture the original color of the submarine?
So the original color, yes. What's really interesting is, as I said before, there were all sorts of attempts to try to make these colors be as close as possible to the original colors that of the U-505. When there were attempts to conserve the boat in the decades after the U-505 opened as an exhibit, if you took a cross section of the hull, you could see various layers of paint because she had been painted several times over. For example, when she was captured, she was painted black and sailed across the Atlantic because that was all part of the camouflage and called the Nemo. Painted again this white color when she was parked outside of the, again, the eastern part of the side of the MSI, when she was outside for all those decades. And then repainted, to my knowledge, repainted once again when she was brought into this 2004 exhibit space. But again, now more than ever before, I think the original colors, if you peek inside the U-505 and especially when you were usually gray. And so there was a certain level of color coding that went on. And these individuals worked towards painting it in the 2 years the conservation took place to paint it to those true colors that existed at the time of World War II.
I have a question about the age of the captain. The second captain of the U-505 was only 24 years old. Was that typical that they would be so young?
As far as I know, not typical. It's my understanding that he came up the ranks rather quickly. The officers, including the commanding officer, of course, usually were older. The average age of U-boat submariners was about 22 years old. But again, the officers were usually much older than that. So for him to come aboard as the commanding officer at the age of 24 was really quite a feat. And I would argue that it wasn't so much the issue of age, but it appears by accounts of the U-505 submariners themselves that there just was this eccentricity about him that didn't work well with them, and because also there were this series of what they considered to be bad luck events, and the ship having some problems when he became captain, you know, that kind of contributed, I think, to what ultimately happens to him. But again, not so common to have a 24-year-old skipper. The other two were certainly older. I can't remember their exact ages, but they were older.
Just read it. Mm-hmm. Okay. We have another comment. I have enjoyed this exhibit since I was 3. What is the address of the video to transfer to underground?
Oh, you mean when the so if I'm understanding this question correctly, this particular guest, which by the way, coming since you were 3, that's great. Keep coming. There's this time-lapse video we have in the exhibit of the U-505 being moved over land near the museum, and then, you know, this space being created and this new exhibit going up. Is that what's being asked? Just want to make sure that's the question.
That was my understanding. Yes.
Right. So I don't know of any, and I might be mistaken, I don't know that that's anywhere on the museum's website. However, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm almost sure. But that time-lapse video is part of the exhibit. And if you come to the museum, you'll be able to see it as you're exiting the exhibit. You go around this balcony that you can see in this photo all the way around, and you come past the U-505 on ground level, and you keep going to where the exit and the restrooms are. You turn a corner there. And as you're heading into, you see the anchor of the U-505, and you see these screens and these panels that show all the sailors and the submariners, all the crew that were involved in the battle and capture. And it's right around there that you have the video feed for the time lapse showing the move of the U-505, which is just wonderful, by the way. It's just amazing to see that.
The technology of the submarine is remarkable, but so was the engineering to move it to the museum the first time and then to its permanent spot now. Is there anything that was, could you share with us the most interesting technology? A little detail is fine, because the whole submarine was interesting, about the U-505 and also about its most recent move. Whatever technology might be particularly interesting.
All right, well, let's start with 1954. That was the first move. So the U-505 at that point in time is parked on that beach. When the U-505 comes down, past the Chicago skyline, takes a little detour, by the way, into the Chicago River, parks next to the Michigan Avenue Bridge, and then goes back out again, sails past the skyline down to 57th Street Beach. There was a need to haul the sub onto the beach. You don't just pull it like a boat, right? And for me, one of the most interesting things about that move was creating a dry dock had to be created for it to lift it up out of the water and just, move it and park it and keep it there for the couple of months that it was before it was then hauled over, again, Lakeshore Drive, which is part 2 of this amazing feat of moving it in 1954. On these rollers, you just have to move it. You stop all the traffic, because that's what happened overnight. And slowly but surely, the U-505 is pulled over Lakeshore Drive. The Lakeshore Drive reopens, and eventually the U-505 is placed in its semi-permanent place. So that's the first sort of interesting technology, that dry dock and the way that they pull it over the Lakeshore Drive. The second part, which was the 2004, the new experience, was, and again, you see this in the time-lapse video and in photos, it's just amazing to see this, is not so much moving it around and getting in position, but this cavity, if you will, that was created in the ground, this exhibit space, is just open, like this open mouth, maw, if you will. And the U-505 being brought into position with cranes and supports and whatever else was needed to slowly lower it into this space. And then of course it's covered. And then on top of that, now we have grass. You can, if you come to the museum and you look at the front entrance, the north entrance, you see to the left there, this little mound area in the lawn. And our lawn is now open. And of course you could probably have lunch, a picnic right on top of the U-505 exhibit. And that's where the exhibit is located. So you're kind of going underground to get there when you're inside the museum. What's really interesting, I think, some of the technology here is that, don't forget, we're right next to a lake and we don't want water getting into that exhibit. So the space that was created, that tub, if you will, of metal and concrete that holds the exhibit together, holds it in there, has to be waterproof. Otherwise, you're going to have water coming in from the lake, all sorts of problems. And so it was intentionally created to prevent that from happening. And I think that's really interesting technology as well.
It most certainly is. I hadn't even thought about the lake. And isn't the land that the museum is on, wasn't that
That's right.
created? It kind of built out?
The land itself, I'm not so sure, but again, if we're to look back at the history of the building itself, it was the last remaining building of the 1893 World's Fair. It was originally the Palace of Fine Arts. So unlike other buildings of the 1893 World's Fair, they did make this particular building more sturdy because artists didn't want to, entrust their works of art and sculpture to any other building at the time. So it was a more sturdy building. But even so, for something like the U-505, that exhibit space that's going to go underground, you want to do whatever's possible to make sure that whatever marshland or water that's from the lake or from that area, creates any kind of problems, future problems, and it hasn't. So it was great.
I have a question about the exhibit. Were there any oral histories captured from either the American crews or the U-505 crew that are part of the exhibit?
Yes, great question. And there were a large number of oral histories that were captured from both American sailors, including those that were, part of these landing parties on the U-505. So those particular sailors that were right there, right after it was captured, who were doing what they could to keep it from sinking, as well as crew from the U-505 as well. So we have a large number of these oral histories from both sides. And a small part of those oral histories have made their way into the exhibit. So when you first enter the exhibit and there's this balcony that you walk around, that's where you can find them with more information about the boarding parties as well, and other information about the German crew members as well. And that's where you can get to see and listen in on a couple of these personal accounts.
I'm just checking. I think that is all. That's all the questions about the U-505. However, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You curated this amazing exhibit, but in looking on the website, see that that's not all you do. You are responsible for 35,000 plus artifacts. Can you tell us a bit about what that's like being the curator at such an amazing place as MSI? And also I see that you have quite a diverse background in the sciences and astronomy and history of science and technology. So perhaps you could just share a little of that for us.
Sure. I wear many hats, but so do, I have to say, the rest of my team in collections. That's the department that I'm in. It's up to us to take care of all of us, not just me, but the rest of the team as well, in collections, to take care of these 35,000 plus artifacts, some of which are out on the floor, many of which are in storage, to entrust them and make sure that they're attacked as stewards and make sure that they're there for future generations. It involves a number of different roles at any given time to make sure that this happens. My job is to do that, but I also serve on exhibit teams and curated a couple of exhibits. I've been at the museum since 2016. Love my work. I have to say, before that, I mean, you could see that I was teaching. My master's and PhD is in history of science, and I was teaching at Lake Forest College for many, many years, but fell in love with museums, fell in love with artifacts and the stories that they tell. And this is the reason why I eventually do what I do and what I do here at MSI. And my primary interest is my degree is in history of astronomy, but I would teach, when I was teaching, I taught European history, I taught women's history, I taught world history. So I have a broad background in history writ large, not just history of science, even though that's my field. And and I think that is the reason why I am really interested in artifact biography, which is to take a look at an artifact, something that's created by humans, and say, hey, why was this created? Why is this important to me? What more can I learn from it? What more can I learn about us? What can I learn about the future? I mean, there's so many different things that you could think about when you just look at one object, and we have 35,000 plus objects. So every day is exciting and different, and I love being able to share that more than anything with a wide demographic, again, from our youngest guests to our oldest guests.
That is a remarkable accounting of how science and humanities comes together in the best
Yes.
ways. Well, I
Yes.
want to thank you and thank our audience for being with us tonight. This was truly an amazing story and really an adventure. I hope everyone can read about it online, attend the exhibit as it stands right now, and as soon as that museum opens again and we're back to normal life, to see you for the tour, to be at the museum for a great tour of inside the U-505. So again, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Saridakis.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And we look forward to coming to the museum.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Take care. Good night.